Hello. So today we are doing dignity, and this will follow our usual pattern where the way I try to arrange these ideas is first to present the human experience of dignity or autonomy or fairness and so on. And that's what we do at the case study at the start. And then the second thing that we do is we try to put a formal definition onto the ideas that we're discussing, in this case, dignity. And then from there, we investigate some of the dilemmas and debates that surround and applications that surround this particular ethical idea. So that's the structure of the way that the seminar sessions work. And we'll just dive right into here. This is, and now it feels very old now, right? A case study from 2014, so that's a decade old. But this is an important study because it is one of the first where we have, and one of the only actually, where we have real data showing the way a real social media company, in this case it's an online dating company like Tinder and so on, it's called OkCupid. We have real data showing the results of their studies, and more importantly, we know exactly what at least some of their studies were. So we have this in the from the OkCupid blog. Again, it's from obviously July 28th, 2014. We noticed recently that people didn't like it when Facebook experimented with their news feed. Later on at the end, I will just give you the details of that, but let's stick with this case for the moment. Even the Federal Trade Commission is getting involved. But guess what? Everybody, if you use the internet, you're the subject of hundreds of experiments at any given time on every site. That's how websites work. Here are the few of the more interesting experiments that OkCupid has run. So great, we're going to see some of their experiments. And again, as I say, what's important about this is they just admitted what they were. I'm not sure admitted is the right word even. I would say that they just reported what they were doing. And so that makes this case very unique. Most other websites were more discreet, are more discreet. And today, no one reports anything if they can avoid it. So this is the person, the lead at OkCupid in offices that look like they're probably look very much like downtown New York City, or maybe someplace in San Francisco that's trying to pretend like it's New York City. His name is Christian Rudder. There he is. There is his offices. Somehow these offices always look empty, right? I'm not sure where the workers are. This is from obviously way before COVID, but somehow these companies all have offices with no one there, and they always look like they have stuff hanging out everywhere. But they do generate websites that work, and OkCupid works. And here's one of their experiments. So this is what they were doing. They were trying to find out a few things. One, they were trying to determine whether or not their recommendations, that is when they said person A and person B are a good match, whether or not that was actually true. The chances that person A and person B were a good match were better than the chances that just random person A and random person B are a good match. So that was one thing they were trying to discover. But they also cleverly thought that, well, you know what? It might be that when we say that person A and person B are a good match, they do perform as a couple better than just a random set of matches. But it could be, the reason for this could be that they've been told they're a good match, right? I mean, this happens all the time. This happens in medicine. It's the placebo effect, right? If you take a drug and the doctor says, this drug will take away your headache, studies show that even if the pill is just a sugar pill, that in some significant percentage of cases, the patients will say, look, the drug worked. My headache is gone. So there is this placebo effect in medicine. And what the OkCupid experiment tries to flesh out is whether or not that placebo effect is also working here on their platform. So they decided to do the following experiment and then measure the results in terms of, as I say, successful coupling. And then how do they measure whether or not a couple was successfully matched? I can't recall exactly what it was, but it was something to the effect of they exchanged something like 5 or more messages subsequently, right? And because that's what the dating site tries to do, right? I mean, it doesn't really promise. It's pretty hard to get them to promise full-on wedding and that kind of thing, even though some talk about that these days. And really what they try and do is they say, we can give you a match that's good enough, so at least you kind of have a start, right? You at least can exchange a few messages. So that's the criteria that they used. They said, look, if we put people together and they start exchanging messages and they exchange, I'm not sure what it is, more than 5 messages over the course of more than 2 days, then we will consider that the machine has worked. And if they don't do that, then it fails, right? So that's how they measured success and failure. And then with that as the background, this is what the experiment did. It's a little bit, well, at least for me, it's a little bit difficult to kind of decode it from the results here. But if you kind of look at it long enough, it does make sense. What they did is they said that their system displays to users. So let's say there's me and Jane Jones, right? The system would display to Jane Jones and I, both of us, that the system finds she and I to be a 90% match, which is good, or a 60% match, which is mediocre, or a 30% match, which actually is not very good according to their system. I guess there's no 0% match for OkCupid. So there's 30, 60, and 90, and Jane and James both see the 90, in which case hopefully we try to connect. If we see the 30, we maybe don't try to connect, but at least sometimes people say, who cares about the numbers? I like the way Jane looks, and I try to connect with her, and she agrees and tries to connect with me, and so on. So they do get, OkCupid does get data from their people that they match at 90%, 60%, and 30%. They can actually see how that works. And then if you just look at the matches, so and you put 30% match as the number displayed to them, and the 30% match, the success rate is 10%, which is really not very good. If the number displayed is 60% and the actual compatibility is 60%, the success rate is 13%. So it does go up a little bit. And then if the match number displayed to them is 90% and their actual compatibility is 90%, then there's a 20% chance that they will exchange this numbers of messages. So, but you notice a few things. First, the success rate of the machine is not very high, no matter what. But it is true. I mean, if you trust their numbers, and they seem fairly straightforward, it does appear to be the case that their matching system does provide some little boost. If your match number is high, the chance that you will end up exchanging messages does increase a little bit. So great. That's the baseline. But the experiment is they said, okay, let's start with that baseline, but then let's find out how much of this effect might be that kind of placebo effect by mixing up the numbers that we show to different people. That is, let's take people who are 90% compatible, that's 90% match, and let's show them let's show them or tell them that they're 60% compatible. So if they're actually 90% compatible and they're told they're 60% compatible, then their let's say their unity score, right, their romance success score drops from 20 to 17. And then if they're truly 90% compatible and they're told that they're only 30% compatible, then their success score drops down to 16. And okay, so that sort of makes sense, right? If people are actually compatible, then when they're told they're not compatible, they have a less positive attitude about the whole thing. And there is a slight decrease in how well the machine works. So that's one result. The other result is, I think, a little bit more interesting. It's, well, what happens when they're actually only 30% compatible, right? Which is not very compatible according to OkCupid. And when they're told they're 30% compatible, only 10% of the time do they break through and get together. But when they're told they're 60% compatible, mediocre, there's a pretty good jump, right? They go up from 10% to 16%, making a good match. And then when they're told they're a really good match, 90% compatible, well, then they jump up to 17%. So you can see there is, according to their data, there is a placebo effect, or as he says here, the mere myth of compatibility works just as well as the truth. And the numbers he's referring to there are the 17 and the 16 that are circled, because if you're really a good match, according to their data, if you're really a good match and you're told you're not a good match, then you have a 60% chance of getting together. And if you're not a good match, but you're told you are a good match, then you have a 17% chance of getting together. So the result of all this is that they can verify to some extent, validate maybe is a better word, not verify the absolute truth, but give some foundation for their claims, that the machine does in fact locate and facilitate romantic connections. But they also show that part of what's going on there, in fact, must be the added effect, the placebo effect, that people are being told they're good matches. You can see on the 30% level that there is a positive, a 7% effect. It's positive for the, or additional 7%, that's positive for the placebo effect. So, again, as he concludes, the mere myth of compatibility works just as well as the truth. That's kind of an interesting finding, right? I'm not clear if you're better off being a bad match who's told they're good, or being a good match who's told they're bad. It's about the same. Everyone agrees. The best thing is to be a good match and told that. So they did that, and they published this on their blog so everyone can see it, could see it. And I think it's very much kind of, I think that is a little bit of a Silicon Valley mentality, right? This idea we're doing these experiments, and experiments are fundamentally good. And so everyone will want to know about this, and it's great and everything. But what they found out when they published that is that not everyone thinks like a Silicon Valley CEO of a dating company. And people got pretty upset. And here are two, I just took two reactions in the blog. It's worth going to. It's now no longer live online, but if you use the Wayback Machine, you can actually find it. You can look up I'll show it to you again here. If you use the Wayback Machine on the internet and go check OkCupid for sometime after July 28th, 2014, you will be able to find this. And there's other experiments. It's very interesting. It's worth looking at, I think. But in any case, the one we're going to look at in this class is the myth of compatibility. And there were, as you can imagine, a lot of reactions to this experiment. And I just chose two of them, which are fairly representative of the larger set. And so one person says, very reasonably, it's good to know at any one time here forward I can trust or distrust your match numbers, not knowing if your lab experiment is resurfaced, right? I mean, it's almost astonishingly blind on the part of the CEO to not realize, well, wait a minute, my users are now going to be ruined. They're going to think, well, this is always just some crazy experiment, and no one's going to accept the placebo effect anymore. But he didn't think that, and just published the results. Then another person Anand says, what if the manipulation is used for what you believe does good for the person? That is what I'm forced to believe is the reason people end up manipulating people for good or money in their own heart. And what I want to show about this, the reason I selected these two is because I think the first one is kind of the that seems to me that would be the standard reaction. I sign up to for this dating site in order to have better chances of meeting Jane, who's good for me, instead of Joan, who's not good for me, and so on. And if you're going to just be messing up the numbers, well, why am I even here? Why am I paying my money to be on the site? It makes no sense. Right? So there's that one reaction, the sensible reaction. But then there's a good point that I think is implicit in what Anand says. And that's the idea that, well, if he's doing these experiments, then he's probably doing it. And in fact, this is what he says if you read the blog. Right? The reason he does these experiments is to try to find out how well the machine works and hopefully to improve the machine. That's why he wanted to do it. And he says this he says this directly too. And it seems to me that makes a lot of sense too, right? Maybe he did have some intellectual curiosity about things, but it's also true, as the owner of the company, he wants the machine to work well. And he's in a kind of a hard place because if you want to improve your machine, you really do, well, you don't really, you do absolutely, you need data. You need to see, well, what works and what doesn't. If you can't measure something, you can't improve it. And in order to measure how well the machine works, right, you need to get some kind of neutral case, right? You need to do something sort of like he did. You have to say, look, let's test what happens when not only I tell people they're a 90% match and they are a 90% match, let's test what happens in maybe it's not a neutral case, but a negative case where they're not a good match and I tell them they are. Otherwise, we don't know if the machine works. And only from there can we perhaps help to improve the machine or change the weightings of the various factors we use to determine what counts as a good match and so on. So the CEO is in a difficult position. On the one hand, of course, he doesn't want reactions like the first one. He doesn't want people saying, why am I using your platform? On the other, kind of like Anand says, he needs to do something to make it better, to improve the machine. So what I want to bring this all around to is what kind of objection you might have to being part of this experiment. And it seems to me that there are two kinds of objections. There's one objection, and that's the first one, the obvious one, which is, well, I'm really mad because I'm paying to get matched and I'm not getting matched. That makes a lot of sense. But it's also true practically, and as I just tried to say, it's also true practically that you can't expect the machine to work or to improve if they don't once in a while do tests to see how well it's working. So I think that to a degree cancels out to a degree, not entirely, but to a degree cancels out the objection of the first person. But then in the second person, he is manipulating people. I really like this last line, end up manipulating people for money or good in their own heart. If we get rid of the money and say that Cupid is manipulating people for good in their own heart, it's still, this is the key point, it's still manipulation. So the users of OkCupid are being manipulated, right? They're being used in these experiments like lab animals. They're being treated like tools, right? Things that I remember your dissection classes in biology, right? People are being treated as tools. Their romantic desires and interests and fears and so on are being dissected by this platform. But they're being dissected maybe with good in their heart. That is, OkCupid is doing it for the good reason that they want the platform to succeed and they want people to find matches. So what I want to say is dignity is that kind of objection you have, that feeling of being manipulated or that objection to being manipulated that exists, even if, or even when you accept that the manipulation might be necessary, and you accept even perhaps that the manipulation is done for your own good. That's the point I really want to bring out, right? You can see in here, within this raw and understandable reaction that people have, like I'm being treated as a thing, I'm being manipulated, exploited by these Silicon Valley CEOs. It's very reasonable to have that human reaction, but that human reaction can be divided into two parts. The one part is this sort of practical side, which maybe you can cancel out and explain away. And then the other side that's left, that's the dignity side. That's the side that says, look, even though it's for my own good and it will help me, I still don't like being treated as a tool in your experiment, as a lab rat. So something like that, I think, is the experience of dignity. That's the way it can be described. How can it be measured? We'll have to look at that as we go further. But the first step is always to try and get the human experience of what autonomy means or what dignity means. And I think that this brings out pretty clearly what the human experience is of dignity. And then that just brings up just a thought that I had. Well, I mean, if there is an objection to people using these clients of OkCupid for their experiments in the dating site, is there also an objection to people like me using, I'm using APB 101 and on. I'm using these people as experiments in my class, right? Is there any difference between those two things? Am I exploiting those people in the same way or in a similar way with respect to dignity as they were exploited in the OkCupid experiment? I'm not sure. It seems to me like it's a close case. I am, in fact, treating these people as sort of tools. I'm manipulating them. I'm cutting out part of what they said and manipulating it and using it for my own experiment, which is not a romantic dating site. Instead, it's a philosophy and ethics seminar. But same thing. I'm taking them out and using them for my purposes. Maybe I could say something like, look, at least I'm protecting their anonymity. I think that makes a difference. But there is something there too, that in a certain sense, I'm exploiting them for my own purposes and my own projects. So that's the experience of human dignity, and the experience of having that dignity to an extent taken away from you or stripped away. Now let's move on to more sort of purely theoretical discussion. And so we'll look at the ChatGPT definition, see how that goes. Then we'll look at the philosophical definition of dignity. There's both a kind of a negative or protective definition of dignity, and then there's also a positive and enabling definition of dignity. And then we will look at a more practical understanding of dignity. So ChatGPT, let's see what ChatGPT says today. I can't remember how I phrased the question last time. Define dignity in AI ethics in 50 or fewer words. Okay. All right. So we'll do it to 100 words. Let's see. So the 50-worder, dignity in AI ethics refers to the principle ensuring that AI systems respect the intrinsic worth of all individuals, avoiding harm, bias, and infringement of human rights and freedoms. That's really a lame definition, right? Dignity in AI ethics refers to principles ensuring that AI systems respect the intrinsic worth of individuals. And that's almost a tautology. It's almost saying dignity is dignity. Dignity is a principle that people's dignity be respected. And then so that's the first part is just worthless. It doesn't tell us what this intrinsic worth is and what is the experience of it. How do you define it? And then the second part, it says avoiding harm, bias, and infringement of human rights and freedoms. So here, in the second part, ChatGPT isn't even telling us about dignity. It's talking about other things like bias, which is part of fairness, or infringement of human rights. Well, that doesn't mean anything on human rights. And freedoms, well, that's autonomy. That's a whole different subject. So we have discussions about fairness, different, and freedom, that's autonomy, different. And then human rights, too general, doesn't mean anything. Avoiding harm, too general, doesn't mean anything. And at the start, as I say, dignity equals intrinsic worth. I mean, that says a little bit, but not very much. So dignity, you can see, is ChatGPT has a hard time with dignity. Let's see what's on the 100. Dignity in AI, I think, of the respect for the intrinsic worth and autonomy of all individuals. Okay, it's making the same mistake. Intrinsic worth, that's good. But then autonomy, so it's defining one value, dignity, in terms of another one. But the whole idea is to define it in terms of itself. If we want to talk about autonomy, we'll talk about that separately. In the design development of AI systems, demands these technologies do not cause harm. Okay, that just doesn't mean anything. What does harm mean? Discriminate, that's fairness. Infringe upon human rights, same thing again, right? Human rights doesn't mean anything. And freedoms is autonomy. Advocates of creation of AI that enhances human capabilities without replacing and diminishing the value of human contributions. Emphasize the need for AI to support diversity and fairness. Those are important considerations, but that's not dignity. Those are fairness considerations. Privacy, again, same problem. That's not dignity. So you can see ChatGPT is just completely destroyed by this. The machine has no way to define or even to begin to understand what dignity is. And there's a reason for that. It's difficult. Dignity is a very hard, unlike personal freedom and unlike privacy. Privacy is going to be very easy to define theoretically, very easy, suspiciously easy. But dignity is, I think that I have some confidence that dignity is the most difficult of these initial principles to define clearly. It's very difficult to get your hands on exactly what dignity means. The experience of dignity is perhaps a little bit easier. Right? The experience, we said, is this feeling that you're being manipulated, that you are being used as a pawn in someone else's projects, for someone else's goals and someone else's successes. So that's the feeling of dignity. But how do you define exactly what counts as dignity or what is not dignity? That will be very difficult to do. But let's start. Let's take a run at it. Dignity, we've said it has the negative or protective side, and it has a positive and enabling side. The protective side, this is one of the more famous sentences in the history of philosophy. It's that you should treat humanity, that means just people, you and I, whether your own person or any other, doesn't mean anything, it just means treat people always as an end and never only as a means. So that's the key part. Treat others as an end and never only as a means. Now, what does end mean? End means the idea of end and means in the sense that something can be a means to an end, right? So you get, for example, money is a means. I mean, no one wants money just to have money. Money is a means. The reason you want money is because it allows you to buy that great penthouse apartment or a beer at the bar on Saturday night, or right, what have you, depending upon how much money you have. But no one is happy, or except people who are kind of strangely greedy, right? No one is happy just holding on to their money, looking at it and feeling it and things. People put their money in their bank accounts because they really don't care about money. Right? The reason they can put it in a bank account is because no one takes pleasure in just having the physical money. The reason you want the money, and the only reason you want it, is because it allows you to get something else. Right? So money is a good example of a means to an end. And applying that logic to the idea of dignity, dignity in the sense of a protective principle, is the idea that people should not be treated like money. They should not be treated only as a means to an end. And therefore, we can say maybe a little more positively, right? Dignity itself, the definition of dignity itself is not being treated as a means to an end, not being treated as a way to get something else. And I think that's a start for a definition of dignity, and it's very much of a protective definition, right? In the sense that it forbids other people from doing things to you, from treating you in a certain way. And I think it's pretty clear if you go back to the OkCupid experiment, it's pretty clear that this definition of dignity is definitely being violated by this experiment, which takes the clients of OkCupid and simply uses them as tools, right, in order to get a result about how the platform can be perhaps improved, how the platform is working and how it can be improved. But that brings us to an important word in the second part of the definition. Treat people as an end, not as means. But it says, very importantly, never only as a means. So Kant leaves open the possibility that you can respect someone's dignity if you treat them in a way that perhaps both uses them as a tool in someone else's projects, but also leaves some area where they are pursuing their own purposes or have their own projects or have a clear way to their own successes and their own achievements, goals, projects, and so on. So what Kant wants to say is, look, it might be true that in real life, it's very difficult to not treat people, at least in some situations, as tools in our own projects. But dignity can still be maintained if, while we do that, we also are trying to help them with their own projects. Right. So the idea of dignity defined is not being treated as a means, as a tool in someone else's projects. But when you take that into the practical reality, Kant says, look, it's very hard to maintain that. So we'll allow a little bit of that violation as long as some part of the treatment also serves your own ends. And then I have a good case here just below. If I hire you, let's say, to write me some code, and I buy a computer for you to work with, is there a difference between how I treat you and how I treat the computer? Right? I mean, in some sense, I'm treating you and the computer in the same way. I'm treating you as a means to my end, right? I'm getting the computer and hiring you because I want you to make and code for me, let's say, a dating site. I want my own James Brusseau dating site. We will call it Even Better Cupid, right there. So I've got my own dating site. I think it's a great idea, but I don't know how to code. I don't know how to make it work. So I hire you to do that, and I buy you a computer. It sounds like I'm doing about the same thing as OkCupid. I am just treating you as a thing. I'm exploiting you, right? I'm saying, look, here's some money, and I want you to do something for me. It's the same thing I do with the computer. Here's some money, and now I have this computer which does something for me. And then there's an aspect of this kind of dignity which also is this idea that people are things, or yes, people are reduced to things in the sense that they are disposable. So think about what happens when a computer stops working. When a computer stops working, we just throw it in the trash. and we get another one. Well, to a certain extent, if I hire you to do code for me, and then you kind of start failing, right? You write bad code. What do? I just fire you and I hire someone else. So you can see there that I'm really treating you like a thing, as something that is replaceable. So part of the notion of not having dignity, or part of the notion of being treated as a means, is this idea that you are disposable. Right? And then connected with the idea that you are disposable, there is also the idea that you are replaceable. So when I throw the computer out, I just buy a new computer. And in fact, I really don't care. Maybe I buy a new computer which is the same make and model as the old one. And it makes no difference to me, right? I don't feel like I've lost anything. And the same thing with hiring people, right? If I fire you and then hire someone else, and if I'm treating you without dignity, then I feel like it's just one thing traded for another. I mean, I don't care whether it's John or Jane who's doing the coding. It makes no difference to me. And I think there's something similar to that, again, going back to the OkCupid experiment. That is, it really seems like the users are being treated as kind of replaceable things, or disposable things. And if their experiences are ruined, their romantic experiences are ruined because they didn't get good matches, well, who cares? We'll just go get new clients. So that's the idea of how people can be treated as things or exploited. They can be exploited or used as a tool or only as an instrument. And then as against that, dignity is this idea that, well, people are not supposed to be treated that way. They're supposed to be treated, going back to ChatGPT, as having intrinsic worth in themselves. And then how can we put add some meaning to that? We could say, look, if I hire you to do code, not only I am treating you like a computer in some ways, but it is also true that I am giving you a paycheck that you can use to pursue for your own projects. This is really the key point here, that in some ways, when I hire you to do code, I'm treating you just like the computer I purchased. But there is this other way. When I give you a paycheck that you can use to pay tuition at the university and take your classes and pursue your own career, find your own purposes, create your own destiny, do your own thing, right? Find your own way in life, all that kind of stuff. What this projects, let's use that word. What this projects is a way that I am using you as an end in and of yourself and not as a means to my end. That is, I'm giving you something, a way to, again, to find your own purposes in life. Right? So the idea that people should be treated always as an end and never only as a means for Kant and for dignity is the idea that whenever we interact with others, we must find some part of that interaction which allows them to be understood and used. Maybe used is not the right word. Allows them to be understood and to live as though their own lives have meaning and importance for themselves. So, use as an end and never only as a means is this idea that is pretty hard in real life to not relate to other people as things sometimes. But there should never be a moment or a time when they are used purely as things. And then to wrap this up, I think that in the OkCupid experiment, what someone like, his name was Christian Rudder, I think, what he could say is, well, look, that's me. That's what I did. I used my clients not only as means. I used them to some extent as tools. I exploited them to make my platform better. But the reason I did that is so that they themselves would get better service later on and have better luck in finding their own matches and then living their own life the way they want to. So, the protective idea is that people should be treated always as ends and never only as means. And I think that the easiest way to understand that in more typical common language would be that people have a right to not be exploited or used as a tool or an instrument. And then some people also like the phrase, they say, people have a right to not be commodified, to not be treated as like corn or grain that gets traded in the markets in Chicago. Okay, so that's the negative or protective definition of dignity. And now let's shift gears a little bit and think of a positive definition. And this one is a little bit more convoluted is not the right word, but it tends to give people a little more pause to kind of think through it. So Kant writes, even if a civil society were to dissolve itself by common agreement of all its members, for example, if the people inhabiting an island decided to separate and disperse themselves around the world, the last murderer remaining in prison must first be executed so that everyone will receive what his actions are worth. Okay, so this is pretty severe, right? Kant says, look, and imagine a society dissolves and everyone goes somewhere else. If there's a murderer in prison, that person must be executed so that everyone will receive what his actions are worth. Now, how is this part of dignity? Well, what Kant understands is that an aspect of dignity, and this is an aspect which doesn't protect you from the way others treat you, but instead it enables you yourself to have dignity. Part of having dignity is expressing the imperative, let's say, to take responsibility for your own actions. What Kant wants to say is there's this idea that when I take responsibility for my own actions, I am acting with dignity, or I am embodying dignity. So let me give you an example. I think that the example of babies is a very good one here. We all know that if a baby, a toddler, whatever age this is, when babies and toddlers, when they go and they steal from another, or just, it's not really even stealing, right? When you put two babies together, two toddlers together, one toddler will inevitably start playing with a rattle or a toy, and the other toddler will come up and just take the toy away. And the first baby will start to cry because it just had his toy stolen or taken away. When that happens, we don't get mad at the baby, right? I mean, we don't punish, we don't send the baby to jail. Instead, what we try to do is we try to teach the baby that, well, you're not supposed to steal things from your friends, or you're not supposed to steal things in general. So you bring the baby back over and have them give back the rattle or what have you. And again, the reason you do that is to teach the baby to take responsibility for his or her own actions. Right? You're not doing that. You're not doing that because you're angry at the baby or you're trying to punish the baby. Because we all say, look, the baby doesn't know any better, right? It's not the baby's fault that the baby takes the toy away. Babies just think, well, there's a toy I want, so I will go get it. Animals do the same thing, right? People, when you see birds fighting each other for a worm or something, and no one thinks, well, that's a morally or ethically bad bird, it should be punished. We think, no, that's just the nature of birds. They see a worm and they want the worm. They don't know it's wrong. And for them, I don't think it is wrong, right? To try to take the worm from some other bird. Same thing with babies. Right? It's not wrong when a baby does that. That's just their nature. And what we try to do as parents, and I mean, not just you and I, but I think in history everywhere, what parents try to do is they try to instill in the baby a sense that it is wrong, right? And a sense that the baby is responsible for their own actions. They can't just wander around taking whatever they want. That's their nature as babies, of course. And again, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with them, but we try to teach them to have accountability or responsibility. So taking all this back to Kant, what Kant says is, look, when the reason that you need to execute the prisoners at the end is so that they have the accountability for their actions. To not execute the prisoner is to treat the prisoner like a baby. Is to say, oh, we don't need to punish you. You're like a baby. You don't know any better. It's condescending. I think that's really a critical part of this definition. The idea that it's condescending. If you don't execute the prisoner, if you just say, "Oh, you can go free," you're treating the prisoner like a baby. Right? You're saying that the prisoner doesn't know any better. It's just a silly prisoner, doesn't know any better. No reason to punish this prisoner. So Kant says that kind of treatment, treating someone as not knowing any better, is like treating them like a baby, and that is for Kant, that is to strip away their dignity. So part of what it means to have dignity, as I say, the protective part is that other people do not treat you like tools or things. But this positive part is the idea that you take responsibility for your own actions. And for someone then to say to you, well, no, you don't have responsibility for your own actions, that's offensive. That's insulting. That's condescending. And it is all those things because it is an attack on your dignity. It's an attack on the idea that you are more than a baby. You make your own decisions and you take responsibility for those decisions. That's dignity. A baby doesn't have that. A baby has the potential for that. And so maybe you could say, look, a baby has dignity insofar as he or she has potential to take accountability for his or her own actions. But at the moment, right, that a baby is a baby, they don't have that kind of dignity. Right? The moment that a baby is a baby, we do condescend to little children, right? We say, look, you don't know any better. We don't blame you because you haven't been around long enough to figure things out. It's not their fault, but it is condescending. And the idea is finally that dignity means dignity means refusing to be treated as a baby. That's the positive or enabling aspect of dignity. That is, it's the right to accountability, the insistence that I make my own decisions and I take responsibility for them. That's the positive expression of dignity. And then, of course, if you go back to the OkCupid thing, then that relates there too, because you say, look, people can't take responsibility for their own actions when they're being manipulated in ways that they don't understand. Dignity in the dating world would be, look, I take responsibility for going out with you or breaking up with you and so on. But you can't do these things if you're being manipulated by the dating website. Okay, so I think here's a question to wrap up the second idea of dignity, the positive part. Going back to Kant's idea that if people are inhabiting an island, decide to separate and disperse around the world, the last murderer remaining in prison must first be executed so that everyone will duly serve what his actions are worth. The question is, who benefits from the execution? Who wants, and this is the part I really want to underline, who wants the execution? And dignity is the idea that the person who benefits from the execution, the person who wants the execution, is the murderer. The murderer wants to be executed as an expression of his or her own dignity, as an expression of the idea that I take responsibility for my actions and I am accountable for what happened. That's dignity. The idea that I don't run away from my actions. I am my actions. So I think that this is a point where when I teach this class live, I frequently have to kind of stop and go through it a few times. But if you can sort of internalize this idea that the person who benefits from the execution is the murderer, him or herself, right? then you've got a good grip on the idea of this positive notion of dignity, which is dignity means the ability and the right to take responsibility for your own actions. Or, to put it in a more colloquial way, the right to not be treated like a baby, right? To not suffer condescension, to not be seen as incapable or incompetent. Right? So the positive idea of dignity is that I take responsibility for my own actions. Okay. So I think we can say that we have kind of two sides to the dignity understanding. The idea that we should be treated as ends and not only as means, which implies that we should not be treated as tools or exploited as things that are replaceable and disposable. That's the one side. The other side is we have the right to accountability, to take responsibility for our own actions, and we are capable of doing that. So those are the two sides of dignity, of the philosophical definition. And then here's a quick practical case. Is the user dignified by this interaction? And the interaction I'm thinking of is these crazy terms and conditions, right? Where we've all had this experience where we're downloading software or something and they ask us to do the terms and conditions, and there's a checkbox and we can always click to read the whole terms and conditions, but no one ever does that, right? I mean, it's never happened in the history of the world that anyone has actually read the terms and conditions. You just check the box and you go on. So the question I have here is, well, I mean, the way I'm putting it, is the user dignified by this interaction? And I'm not sure. It's hard to be absolutely certain. On the one side, it's true that the user is being respected. Let's take the second part of it. The user is being respected as someone who takes responsibility for his or her own actions. You check the box. You take responsibility. Here's the terms and conditions. If you decide that you don't need to read them and you're just going to check them, well, that's fine. You're an adult. You're not a baby. I'm not going to condescend to you. If that's your decision, you can do that. So in that way, these terms and conditions, in that way, they do, in fact, support, or rather, they treat the user as being dignified. On the other hand, it's also true that no one ever reads the terms and conditions. So there is a sense in which users are being manipulated because you can put whatever you want in those terms and conditions. And people do put a lot of crazy stuff. Like most websites put in clauses where they say, if you sign up for our website, we can, maybe they don't say this explicitly, but they do say something to the effect that we can use you as tools in our experiments, right? They find some diplomatic way of putting that, but that's what they do. Right? And then they hide, to a certain extent, they hide that they're creating this legal capacity for themselves. They hide that by just making this simple checkbox, which, well, you can quickly check and then go on with your life. Look how quick and easy that is, right? So in that way, it seems to me that this is not an example of a dignified interaction. In this way, it seems to me that users are being treated as things. They're being exploited. They're not really being given the information they need to make good decisions about whether or not they want to turn over their personal information and so on to the website. So this is a hard case. I mean, on the one side, as I say, it seems to me a little bit like people are being exploited by this. You just make it seem really easy and fast, and you don't really care about whether this agreement is good for the user or not. So it seems like you're treating them as means only and not as ends. But then on the other side, you are giving them the choice. So it seems like you are respecting their ability to make their own decisions and to not treat them as babies. So it's difficult. Dignity, as we will see, is extremely knotted, right? It's hard to find clear cases, which are not just very extreme, but in everyday life, it's very hard to find clear cases of dignity. Almost everything that we are involved in is in some ways a threat to our dignity, but also in some ways an ability for us to express our dignity. And it's very difficult to pull. It can be very difficult, as in this case, to put any experience overwhelmingly on one side or the other of dignity. Okay. Now, I promised, just to close out this section on the definition, I promised I would tell you quickly what the Facebook experiment was. You should know this. This is from 2012. I mean, not that you should know this now, but as part of taking this course, you should know this because this is a famous case. This is called the Facebook contagion experiment or emotional contagion experiment. And what they did is they changed people's, as you can read here, they changed people's feed in terms of happy things and sad things, good news and bad news. They gave them more and more good news or more bad news, more and more happy things and more or sad things, and then look to see what kinds of responses the users had in their own comments to others and their own comments on their own wall and in general on their platform, the users' own responses, or their own actions on the platform. And what Facebook found was that when they put into users' feeds more negative and unhappy things, then users themselves when they did other things on the platform, they themselves were more negative and unhappy. And by contrast, when users were receiving more positive things, then the users themselves, when they went out and talked about other people's posts or talked about things that were going on in their lives and so on, in all those kinds of other ways, the users themselves were more positive. And so there is this power here, a terrific power. We have presidential elections every 4 years. Obviously, this is a real power that Facebook has. If they can influence whether people are happy or sad, then it's a pretty short step to say, well, they can influence whether people are happy or sad about candidate A or candidate B. Or they can influence whether people are happy or sad about movie A versus movie B. And that's a very powerful ability. And it shouldn't take a lot of imagination for you to think that, well, political candidates and movie makers and restaurants and things, they might be willing to pay Facebook to manipulate the news feed of people at the moment when they are about to get information about a certain restaurant. For example, if you want to advertise a restaurant on Facebook, maybe you could pay Facebook extra money for their feed to first get some positive and happy kind of news and things. Then, bang, you get them with the ad for the restaurant, and the people are in a good and positive mood, so they say, oh, great recommendation, I love this restaurant, and so on. Or you could do it the opposite way if you want to attack your competitor, right? You could pay Facebook extra money to put the competitor's ads to nest it inside a lot of negative kinds of thinking and thoughts, and so you try to pollute their ad with this negative kind of connotation and negative reaction. So that's the Facebook contagion experiment. That was the first sort of look that we had at the real sweeping social power that these websites have. And I think it's pretty clear from what we have said that these kinds of experiments and the use or the treatment of users as simply tools to be exploited in this emotional contagion, I think that's pretty clearly a dignity violation. Well, I don't think that is clearly a dignity violation. People are being treated, right, when their posts, when their feeds are being manipulated, people are being treated like lab rats, like experimental animals. They are being treated as ends and not means. Right? Because here, it's very difficult to see how these experiments would help the user. At least in the case of OkCupid, what the CEO could say is, well, look, I was doing these experiments on the users in order to help those users get better dates. Okay, I mean, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, I don't know, but the logic makes sense. But here, that's not the case. Here in the Facebook example, it's just pure manipulation. They are using their own clients in order to get information about how they can manipulate even more their own clients, right? So they are manipulating their clients so they can figure out how to manipulate their clients. That's a dignity violation for sure. The famous Facebook contagion experiment. Okay, so why don't we just take 5 minutes and think about, try to form your own response to the terms and conditions questions, your own question, your own thought about whether that's a dignity violation or not. Okay, so we have sort of what is dignity straightened out. And then there are a couple of dignity dilemmas that we can look at. One is, well, I guess they're both in psychological health. The one I like is the question about mimetic AI. So let's dive right in. So dignity, mental health, and mimetic AI. We need to quickly understand the elements of this case study or this dilemma. The first is that the first element is the woebot or the conversational agent. With these large language models, now we are seeing an explosion of these online. Some of them are online friends, some are online lovers and girlfriends and boyfriends and such. In this case, what we're talking about is an online friend called a woebot, which is a text messaging service that is used to treat mild depression, like woebot, or people who are mildly depressed. And it's aimed mainly at the elderly, people who are alone a lot, especially elderly women. There is a disparity. Men tend to die, in married couples, men tend to die earlier than the women. So if you go, anyone who has elderly parents has gone to a nursing home, has seen that in room after room, it's woman after woman after woman. There are very few men in these nursing homes. And so in many cases, these women find themselves to be more or less alone. Perhaps their friends have moved away, or they can no longer have the ability to go visit their friends. They can't drive and so on. And as I say, their husbands have passed away. Though in some cases, of course, there are men without women. In some cases, the couple is together, but they're still lonely. Anyway, overall, there's a lot more elderly women who feel alone and moderately depressed, not severely depressed, but moderately depressed, because they don't have a lot of social interaction. And what this conversational agent does is it provides interaction for these elderly and lonely women. So that's the woebot, and that's the idea of a conversational agent. Now, let me do the next idea, which is the mimetic AI. Now, mimetic AI is really quite important. Mimetic AI is the next step in large language models. It's the idea that instead of having, let's say, a robot or a conversational agent that is the perfect general doctor, right? That's kind of what ChatGPT is. ChatGPT doesn't claim to be any particular doctor or any particular person. If you ask it a question, what it tries to do is it tries to give you a response that captures all the wisdom of all the world, right? It tries to be the combination of, let's say, if you ask ChatGPT a medical question, like my back hurts, why? If you ask ChatGPT that question, it will try to answer not as any specific doctor, but as the best answer that every doctor in the world would have if they all got together and studied your case, right? It's the very best, and it's kind of almost an inhuman answer, right? It's the optimal answer, which represents the very best ideas of everybody. That's what ChatGPT does. But mimetic AI is different. What mimetic AI tries to do is it tries to represent or capture in language the response of a single person. So it's not the general doctor, but it would be your doctor that you're speaking with on this this language model agent, or this robot. And some of the first research in this happened in the area of chess, because first, and I think many of us know, right, you can play chess against the computer. So you just play yourself, and then the computer, which is this general idea of the perfect chess player, the computer plays against you. And you can set the computer for different levels of ability, right? So you can have fun playing against the computer. But recent research, what people have learned how to do is say, look, I don't want to play against the computer. I want to play against Bobby Fischer, who is a specific chess champion and who has a very specific style. So I want the computer to play not perfect chess or not great chess, but I want the computer to play chess like Bobby Fischer played it, which in some ways is very strong, but in other ways is sort of weak. Just like any human being, Bobby Fischer and any chess player, no matter how good, is going to have, and how bad, is going to have some things they do well and some things they do poorly. Right? So mimetic AI is that idea. It's artificial intelligence that mimes or copies or imitates a specific person, as opposed to being this general and perfect representation of chess player. So we have two things now in the mix. We have these robots, we have these conversational agents that the elderly can, we're just going to, of course it applies to everybody, we're just going to say the elderly, that the elderly can use for interaction. And now we have moved it up a level, and it's not just that they can use it for interaction, they can use it for interaction with a specific person. That's the dilemma I want to talk about when you have those robots plus the mimetic AI. So this is the dilemma. You could imagine in a nursing home that there's a therapist in the nursing home, but of course the therapist has many patients, and the therapist cannot be available to any patient at any time, right? The therapist can only be available to each patient during a specific and probably fairly small window. What mimetic AI offers is the possibility that we could train one of these robots, we could train a conversational agent in our phone to act just like the specific therapist that exists in the nursing home. So that the let's just say this elderly woman who's there in the nursing home, right? If she wants to talk with her therapist at any time, she feels lonely this morning, she feels hungry, so on, and wants to get some response and some feedback, normal human stuff, right? All she needs to do is pick up her phone and start texting, and she gets a response back which sounds just like her own therapist, right? Which uses the same kind of vocabulary, which uses the same kind of general tone. Like some therapists are very positive and optimistic, some therapists are more scientific and direct, and so on. Everyone has their own tone and style, and you can incorporate that tone and style into the mimetic AI. So that possibility is what is being proposed here. And then the dilemma is, okay, this is the dilemma. The dilemma is, if you have that, should you tell this elderly woman that the person on the other end of the phone is not her therapist? because it probably would be fairly easy. I happen to have my mother is quite elderly, so I sort of know what things are like in this world. It would be fairly easy to give, at least my mother, and I think this is true more generally, not in every case, but in many cases, it would be fairly easy to give my mother a phone which she can kind of work and tell her that it was the therapist from the nursing home in which she resides. Tell her that therapist was there for her whenever she wanted. And I think that she would sort of believe, at least quite frequently in her interactions, she would believe it, right? She would just think, oh, this is her therapist. Now, the question is, let's imagine that that her thinking that it really is her therapist is better for her health. Let's imagine that it does make her happier when she's on her phone, when she believes that she really is interacting with her therapist, that she's really interacting with another person and not just a machine. Again, that's very human. That makes sense, right? We tend to feel better when we're interacting with other humans instead of machines. It tends to drive us crazy, in fact, when we're interacting with just machines. We always push 000, operator, human voice, please, right? So you have this case with this elderly woman where you can give her access to her therapist 24 hours a day. And if you just don't tell her that it's mimetic AI, then at least in some cases, and for this experiment, we're going to say that we can make her life better by not telling her the truth. So that's the dignity dilemma. It's not a biological dilemma. It's not a health dilemma. Let's say because let's just imagine that there is evidence, and I think there is evidence that this kind of manipulation does help people's biological health and does help in some sense their psychological health. They are less depressed if they think they are talking with another person, even if it's not really another person. So lying to patients does work. The question is, do you do that? Should you do that? That's the dignity dilemma I want to pose to you. I mean, is it worth it? Would you do this? Would you do this to your own mother? Would you lie to your own mother about this conversation if it would help her biological health and help her feel less depressed? The dignity argument against that, I mean, obviously, of course, there's a lot of arguments for that, right? I mean, in a nursing home, part of what they want to do there is worry about your biological health. So if it helps, they're going to be tempted. And we will come to some other arguments later, but this is a case where the dignity argument probably is going to run, at least to some significant extent, against you using that kind of technology. At least that's the argument that most people have in this context. And the reason that the larger reason is that there's this sense that patients are being manipulated. They're being treated as tools. Their health is being treated as, it's almost like a thing. It's almost like a car, right? You want the car to go better, so you change the oil or you put higher test gasoline in the car, right? When you're using these kinds of robots with mimetic AI, you're almost treating the person like a car, right? You're just changing their gasoline, and so they're better. It does seem like you're treating them as a thing, as simply a tool that can be manipulated one way or another. That's the general argument. And the more specific argument, this comes from one advocate of this argument is a man named Frank Pasquale. There are other advocates of this argument. He says, look, when you use the robot in this way, it counterfeits language. And when it's not true language, and here's an example of what a conversation actually looks like. He says, look, this is not true language. This is not really the way humans interact with each other. And it's worse than that. It's worse than that. What the Woebot does is it reduces human language to worthless exchanging of words, right? When computers, imagine you had two computers making up a conversation to each other. You would just laugh and say, well, this is worthless. This is silly. This is stupid. Who cares about what computers say to each other, right? The argument here is that when you have humans talking with the computer or a Woebot, it's not that the human brings the Woebot conversation up to the human level. Instead, it's that the Woebot brings the human conversation down to the computer level. It debases human language. It makes counterfeit human language. It makes everything worthless. The person is being treated, on the one hand, the larger argument is we should not do this because the person is being treated as a tool to be manipulated. And the more concrete argument is, specifically, the person's language and ability to speak and talk and think is being reduced to the level of a simple machine. That's an interesting argument. It's a good argument. It's a strong argument. I'm not sure that it's persuasive, but it's an interesting argument that when a human being talks with a computer, it's not that the human being brings the computer up, the computer brings the human being down. That's the argument. I'm not sure. And then, I asked the question here, how could a developer, if you're making one of these tools, how could a developer counter that argument? It's a strong argument. It's hard to counter the idea that computer language is really, in and of itself, it is really senseless and worthless. As I say, the experience of that, we know that because when we just put two computers talking to each other, well, no one takes that seriously, right? So it just seems as though, in our own basic reaction, it just seems as though computer language is empty, it's vacuous, it's not dignified. And if that's right, then the secondary argument is pretty powerful, that humans are being debased by being involved in this language. So that's the dignity argument against using the Woebot. But on the other hand, of course, you have to say, look, biological health is important. What if the depression gets more severe? What if you can draw a link between depression and longevity? What if you can show that people who are depressed are more likely to suffer let's just invent this. I'm just inventing this. People who are depressed are more likely to suffer heart attacks. If that's true, then the dignity argument against using the Woebot is really being placed against the possibility of death. So then you're asking, well, what's worth more, the human dignity or human life? And remember, for Kant, the answer to that question is clear. Dignity is worth more than life. So Kant would say, look, it's not worth living. Life is not worth anything if you don't have your dignity. So therefore, it might be true that this Woebot thing it can keep these patients more happy, and therefore it will save them from depression, and therefore make them more healthy, and therefore save their lives. It may be true that the Woebot saves their lives, but even so, we should not do it. It's not worth doing because dignity is worth more than life itself. That's a very powerful argument for Kant. He says, look, even if you can save your life, don't do it. Now, that's not persuasive for everybody. Many people say the opposite. Many people say, look, I prefer to be alive without dignity than to have dignity without life. You have to make your own decisions there. A different kind of argument is you could say, look, it may be true that the Woebot, this mimetic AI, does detract from people's dignity, but it also increases their autonomy, their personal freedom. Why? Because when they are not depressed, they have more energy to make their own decisions about the kinds of things they want to do. They have more energy to decide that they want to go have this meal or go play this game with others. So their personal freedom does increase. So there you might want to say, look, it's true that this woebot does insult the dignity of the patients. It treats them like things, but it's worth it because it increases their autonomy. It increases their freedom. So here you're saying essentially that autonomy is worth more than dignity. And of course, you could say the opposite too, right? And then the third kind of argument is the happiness argument. Being happy, being in a good mood is good, right? It's desirable. Being happy is desirable. We want people to be happy, and if that's the case, right, then we could say, look, just the elderly. Let's just take her. This elderly woman's happiness is worth more than her dignity. I'd prefer that she be happy without dignity than that she have dignity without happiness. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, but what I am trying to say is that you don't need to accept the dignity argument. You can say, look, I'm willing to sacrifice dignity for human life. I'm willing to sacrifice dignity for human autonomy. I'm willing to sacrifice dignity for human happiness. But you can also go the other way. I mean, you can be like Kant. Kant was a hardcore guy. Kant said, look, I will not sacrifice dignity even for human life. Life without dignity is not life at all, he would say. Or he wrote many long books. I'm certain that in one of those books somewhere he said something to the effect that life without dignity is not life at all. Okay, so that's the dilemma one. This idea, basically the dilemma is, we'll put it in personal terms, do I lie to my own mother by giving her this woebot and telling her that it is her therapist? Do I do that? And the dignity argument, I think, is no, because I'm treating her as a thing. I'm using her as a means to an end, which is biological health or autonomy or happiness. I'm treating her as kind of disposable, as a lab rat. On the other hand, as I say, that you can just say, well, yes, it's true. It's true. I'm using her as a means to an end, but I'm using her as a means to an end for things that are good, like health, like life, like autonomy, like happiness. So you make your own decisions. Okay, so that's the first dignity dilemma. The second dignity dilemma is a kind of form of that. We have the same sort of background idea that if you can give this phone to someone, that they will benefit in terms of their depression and their life and so on. And this is a more practical version of the dilemma. It is that you could give this, let's say, you could give this phone with the woebot to, let's just say, my mom. And you could do it in two ways, right? You could either 100% lie to her and just say, oh, this phone connects you with your therapist whenever you want. Just type in and the therapist will respond and it's great. So you could lie all in. Or you could kind of tell a half truth. I guess it would be a full truth. You could say, look, sometimes, we'll just use my mom as this example. Sometimes, Mom, when you are on this phone, right? Sometimes when you're on this phone, the person on the other end is your therapist. But sometimes when you are on this phone, the person is just an AI model, mimetic AI model. So you could tell her the truth. And then, of course, to make it true, you would have the therapist at least once in a while, when the message came in, just respond to my mom. And that way you were telling her the truth. And in that way, maybe you could avoid the dignity, or at least partially avoid the dignity concern, because you are not exploiting my mother in the sense we're telling her the truth and we are allowing her to make her own decision, right, and take responsibility for her own decision about whether or not she wants to use this phone in these conditions, where sometimes it's the therapist, sometimes it's a machine. So you have these two solutions, and it seems to me that this is the reason for this dilemma is I think that this is a dilemma that could really arise, and if it has not already, it will really arise in the near future in nursing homes for our parents. We will have to actually make a decision like this. And so, right? I mean, do you tell them the truth and get that benefit, or do you tell them the lie and get the other benefit? I suppose if it could be shown that the telling the patient the truth did not harm the outcome of the robot usage, then you would just tell the truth. But kind of implicit in this experiment is, or it's not an experiment, this dilemma is the idea that if you tell them the truth, it decreases the positive impact of the robot, because, of course, then the patient will always be thinking, well, maybe this is not the real doctor. Maybe this is the computer talking. Right? So there is an advantage to lying. All right. So I think this second version of the dilemma is really very close to the first, but what I like about it is that it gives you two very concrete paths that you could take, and it's real world. I think this is something that, as I say, if it has not happened yet, it will happen in the near future, that people will really have this decision to make. Either tell the whole truth, or, right? Or lie to the patient and get those medical benefits. So you can decide for yourselves, why don't you take just a few minutes and think about this dilemma and which one route you would take. Or if you can think of a different route, that would be also good. If you can think of a different way that maybe dignity could be better preserved while also getting the positive health effects, that would be good. Okay, so we have three more sections. These are going to be quicker sections because I think we have done now the main big ideas. We have defined what dignity feels like in this experiment of OkCupid. We have given the philosophical definition of dignity, both the protective one, which is ends and not means, and the positive one, the right of accountability. And now we've looked at some good case studies. I think that this elderly person and the robot is a very representative case study of how dignity works in the world. And I think we can move a little bit more quickly now through some other questions. One area where people talk about dignity a lot is in the area of artificial intelligence weapons. Now, this is this is partially science fiction, but again, every day it's less science fiction and more true. Weapons can be dispatched and with cameras that are trained and to recognize maybe people below as carrying rifles or something. The AI would then recognize that these are people carrying rifles, and so therefore they must be combatants. So therefore they are the enemy. So therefore we can shoot, the AI could shoot a missile at one of these people. Of course, the way this is working now in the real world is, for the most part, those decisions are relayed back to some human being in a control room somewhere who then gives an order to fire or not fire. But we could imagine situations where decisions need to be made very quickly. Let's say people are running across the street and the decision needs to be made, fire now or you will lose the opportunity, right? There's not enough time for the human to make a decision. This is one of the advantages of artificial intelligence, is it can analyze a situation and make a decision just instantly, right? Whereas human beings, they would have to look and study, and by the time, as I say, imagine kind of urban warfare, and enemy combatants are shuffling or running from one building to another. By the time a human being looks at the video and says, yes, that looks to be kind of a rifle, so I guess it's probably a combatant, so I guess I can push the OK to fire the missile. Well, by then, they've already run into the next building and they're safe. So you could imagine a real-world scenario in sort of urban battle where the AI could video and instantly recognize people carrying weapons and then instantly fire a missile, which perhaps could successfully strike before the people find safety in the building. So I'm not sure exactly what the state of the art is now with respect to AI and war, but certainly we're fairly close to the point where we might have autonomous weapons systems actually functioning. And to the degree that's true, this is an area of significant ethical debate. And there are two major arguments that surround this question. The way I'm putting the question here is, are AI weapons dignified? Or more specifically, does dignity ethics, this idea of dignity that we have been discussing, is that support the use of autonomous AI weapons, or does that undercut justification for the use of those weapons? And there are basically two arguments. Two arguments receive the most attention, and these are arguments against. Dignity arguments tend to work because dignity is such a human ethics. Because it's based so much on the value of human existence and the fact that people should be treated as things that have their own purposes, and those purposes must be respected no matter what. And their own ability to take accountability for their own decisions must be respected no matter what, and so on. Because that dignity or that worth of our purposes in our life is so great, it's in general, the theory is very protective against artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence does tend to treat human beings as things, right? It does tend to analyze human beings as other machines, right? And then creates recommendations and so on. So dignity is very much of a protective ethics against machines. There are other ethics we will see which are less protective, but dignity is very protective. And so most times the people use dignity in response to artificial intelligence. Most of the time it's in an argument that is against the use of artificial intelligence or for limiting the use of artificial intelligence. And that's true with respect to AI weaponry. So there's the dignity of human life argument against AI weaponry. And the argument here is that we should not use AI weapons because human lives have dignity and have this kind of special dignity quality. And only other human beings should have, or in some sense, may justifiably take the life of a human being not because it's life, but because you're taking away dignity too. So that's the general form of the argument, that only someone who has dignity or something, let's say, that has dignity, and maybe only humans have dignity, only something that has dignity can take the life of another thing with dignity. It's almost the idea that the dignity is a kind of club that you're in, and if you're in that club, then right, you only have to worry about threats from other people who are dignified. And I think so. That's the broad argument. That having dignity means your life can only be taken by someone else who has dignity. Another way of making that kind of argument, and I think this is a little bit more tangible, is that when you use AI to make decisions about life and death, then life becomes like a video game. Everything becomes counterfeit. It's the same argument as the language argument when you're having exchanges with a robot. It's not that you bring the robot's language up to your level. It's that the robot brings your language down to its level. And the same thing is happening with killing through AI. it's not that you, the human being, brings the AI weapon up to the human level. It's that the AI weapon drops the human life down to the machinic level, right? And killing becomes counterfeit. Killing, when you're killed by an AI, it's like killing in a video. It makes human life like a video game. And it's just like pixels disappear and no one cares. Right? Of course, when you die in a video game, you don't care. You just push a button and you go back to life. That's not the way it works in human reality, however. The argument, though, is that the use of AI weaponry, in essence, reduces human life to a video game character. You're being treated as something that's where death doesn't even matter anymore, where it's just part of a game. It's just pixels disappearing. And in a sense, that's what it is with AI, right? Because the human beings only see what happens through a video feed. So it's only a digital processing feed that allows them to even see what's happening. So in some almost tangible way, it's true that AI weaponry reduces human existence to, it makes it counterfeit. It makes it like a video game. So that's the argument. That's the dignity of human life argument against AI weaponry. It's the idea that AI weaponry reduces human life to a video game. And then, of course, there's always counter arguments. And the common counter argument against this stance is that really there's no difference between artificial intelligence and bombs that are dropped from airplanes and rifles that allow us to kill one person at a great distance, and landmines, which allow us to kind of put a bomb in the ground and then walk away, and then it kills someone later. We don't know who or how or why. All those three kinds of armaments that we just use commonly, that are unfortunately, part of wars that are happening all the time. All of those kinds of machines also kill people, and they kill people impersonally, right? They kill people without concern for their dignity. It's not really me. Let's say I'm in the Army and I'm an airplane pilot dropping bombs. My bombs are killing people. It's true, but I'm not doing it. I just kind of push the button and drop the bombs and fly back to the base. I don't even know what happened. Is there really, and this is the objection, is there really any difference between that bomber pilot who just presses the button, drops the bombs, and returns to the base, and the AI war tool? Let's say in this case, it's like a drone, which the human just pushes the button, the drone goes up and looks for an enemy and just fires and then comes back. Maybe, so two things. The first is, it seems to me there's not a lot of difference there. So if we are going to have bombs, and we do have bombs, and we're going to have landmines, and we do have landmines, then why wouldn't we have AI weaponry? It seems like it's hard to have one without the other. But that doesn't change the fact, someone who really wanted to defend dignity would come back the other way and say, well, okay, the dignity solution is not to stop at AI weaponry, is to say, look, what AI weaponry teaches us is we should not use AI weapons, and we should also not use bombs and not use rifles and landmines, right? And so that the debate would look like that. So I think and most people agree that there is some substance to the dignity argument against AI weapons, but most people also agree that it's hard to say that artificial intelligence weapons are really unique in the way they operate in war, compared with things like bombs. Right? So that's one argument about AI weaponry. The second argument against AI weaponry is that when a drone like this is released and goes off and kills someone, of course it's going to happen in war that once in a while, or maybe more often than that, the drone will kill the wrong person, will kill a civilian or something, which obviously no one wants. Now, when that happens, at least perhaps when bombs are dropped that way and so on, we can sort of find out who was responsible for that decision. It would probably be the person who gave the initial order to bomb in that specific place, at least if they knew that civilians might be hit, right? And then that person might say something like, look, I knew that some civilians might be killed, but this particular bombing run attacked a weapons factory, so it was a legitimate military target. And so I made the decision, a general could say, to have bombs attack that area to blow up that building. And I made that decision knowing that some civilians might die. So then the general or the commander could say, I'm the one who's accountable for this decision. And it's the right decision. Some civilians died. I don't want that. But my main military objective was to destroy this factory. And that objective had sufficient military importance that it was worth attacking directly, even if it meant that there was some collateral deaths. Now, you can debate that, right? You can say, well, that's not true, or that is true, but there is a clear line of accountability, right? You know who you're debating against, right? You can actually have the debate, right? Should this have been done or should it not have been done? And then later on, you can decide. But the debate itself is really important. The problem with artificial intelligence is if you send a drone up to look for enemies and it fires and shoots and kills someone, but it turns out that was a civilian, it can be really hard to know who is accountable for that. It can be really hard to know who you can debate with, right? I mean, if you say, look, this should not have been done, who do you take your complaint to? Do you take it to the soldier, like the soldier pictured here who released the drone? Or do you take it to the person who designed the drone, or the person who designed the artificial intelligence that made the drone's decision? Or do you blame the drone itself? I mean, if the drone made a bad decision, do you put the drone in prison? I'm sort of making a joke, but not really. And the whole thing with respect to artificial intelligence, or the explanation or the tracing of accountability with respect to what happens in some cases is extremely difficult. It can be hard to know when an AI is up there making a decision and acting on that. I mean, it can be hard to know who to blame. And if you think at least purely rationally, there is a case that you could make if the AI kills a civilian. You could make the case that you should take the AI drone and put it in a jail cell. I mean, of course, we would never do that. But in terms of pure rationality, that makes almost as much sense as saying, well, we should punish the soldier who released the drone, or we should punish the person who designed the drone, or we should punish the person who made the AI code that directed the drone. Because these machines, these artificial intelligence machines, are so complicated, and because they tend to make decisions which are, in some sense, independent, right? Because you give the drone directions on how to recognize a foreign combatant, you give the drone then directions to shoot that combatant, but you can't give the drone overly specific directions, because every combatant is going to wear slightly different color clothes and hold his or her rifle in a slightly different way and so on. So you do need to program the drone with some flexibility. And in some sense, later on, when we talk about explainability, I will want to modify what I'm going to say now. But right now, I will just say, in some sense, the drone does make its own decision, right, about what is a target and about when to fire at that target. It's not just the case that the human give very specific directions. When you see exactly this rifle and exactly this posture, then shoot. No, the human AI coder gives a bunch of different pictures of rifles and says essentially to the drone, again, I'll want to adjust this later. I'm anthropomorphizing now, but I'm doing that for the sake of this discussion. The directions you give are much more like, if you see something that looks kind of like this, then in that case, you can shoot. I mean, in a sense, then, if the drone makes a mistake, it's the drone's decision that's wrong. So you could reasonably say the drone should be sent to prison, just as you could reasonably say the AI coder could be sent to prison, or the operator of the drone, or the soldier that released the drone into the air, or maybe no one, right? You can also say, this is called the responsibility gap. You can say, look, when you use AI in some situations, no one is responsible because it's just impossible to figure out who really made the decision which triggered the action that killed this innocent civilian. So if that's right, and this is what the argument rests on, if it is right that in the case of AI weaponry, this responsibility gap exists, and we can't tell who is to blame when the drone does something wrong, then the dignity argument is we cannot use the drone because the dignity idea that a human being should always be accountable, there always must be someone accountable for an action. Right? We can't just say it's no one because it's a condescension to ourselves. We, as dignified members of the military, we insist that there be accountability for our own actions because we're not babies. We actively take responsibility for what we do. So whenever we use a weapon, we must only use weapons where we can attribute responsibility for that use. And we insist upon that ourselves as part of our own dignity. And if it happens that AI disallows that kind of responsibility, it has lives lost without accountability, as I put it, well, then maybe the dignity argument is that we should not use that weaponry. Though against this argument, against this dignity argument, there's also the case that, look, AI weapons also save lives because soldiers, instead of sending people in planes with bombs over the enemy and maybe having them be shot down, now when the AI drone is shot down, it's just a machine, so lives are saved. The argument here is, look, AI weapons save human lives, and maybe that's worth more than the loss of the dignity. Or maybe you could even say, look, these human lives that are saved, they have dignity too. So we're willing to give up a little bit of dignity to use these arms, these weapons, these AI weapons, but it's worth it because we get back more dignity for these lives saved in terms of these soldiers that are not put at risk because they don't have to fly a plane over enemy territory and shoot these missiles. So the debate goes on. There's no, as is the case generally with respect to dignity, they are debates that it's very difficult to find an answer that satisfies everyone. And part of that reason is the dignity itself. It's so slippery. It's so hard to grasp exactly what it is and when it isn't. Well, it's not when it is in play. I mean, for Kant, dignity is always in play. It's always part of what's happening. But it's very difficult to isolate the dignity. It's very difficult to take it out and say, here's the dignity part of what is happening. Unlike, let's say, going back to the question of the Woebot, when you talk about biological health, it's relatively easy to abstract that from a situation and say, look, I can measure the health a person has. I can measure whether they have a heartbeat or not. I can measure how much time they spend out of bed and so on. I can measure their health in a concrete way. Dignity, it's very hard to measure. It's very hard to get your hands on exactly where it is in a situation. And because it is so slippery, most debates in dignity look like the ones we saw with the AI chatbot or here with weapons. They're debates where you can kind of go back and forth for a very, very long time. Okay, but that's the debate. Why don't you just take a few minutes and think for yourselves about whether it seems to you that within the realm of the ethics of dignity, AI weapons and their potential responsibility gap, with their potential responsibility gap, whether or not they are justified. Of course, just jumping ahead a little bit, right? You could also say maybe, look, we can only use AI weapons when we can understand exactly who's at fault when they go wrong, the programmer and so on. That would be a solution too. Okay, so two more points are left. One point is this question about dignity versus utilitarianism. This is a kind of a standard debate in the literature, and this sets Kant, who is a German from the 1700s, against Nietzsche, who is a German from the 1800s, and Nietzsche has a very, or not, I shouldn't say, it's not against. It sets Nietzsche with Kant, but in a kind of a different way. Nietzsche has a very famous quote. He says, "Man does not strive for happiness; only the Englishman does that." Nietzsche here is actually stepping in favor of Kant, though in a little different way that maybe we won't talk about now. But what Nietzsche is saying is that some form of dignity really is worth more than happiness. Right? So going back to this original experiment, most people who get involved in dignity debates usually end up in one way or another, if they want to defend dignity, usually end up in one way or another saying that human dignity is more important than some form of human happiness. And in the case of the dating application, right, the argument in favor of these experiments is that, or the strong argument, it seems to me, is that ultimately these experiments help the machine to function better. So it makes better dates, makes better relationships, and that makes better happiness in the long run. Right? And so happiness is worth it. It's worth manipulating some users a little bit at the start in order to help all users be happy in the end. And one real advantage of this stance is that in some sense, happiness usually can be measured, at least to some extent. I mean, usually you can say, look, happiness in a relationship is how long they stay married, right? Or happiness in a relationship, and let's say at the early stages of a relationship, happiness is how many messages they exchange back and forth. Right? Now, maybe these are crude measures. Maybe they're not direct measures of happiness. Of course they're not. But they are some measures, right? They do give you some sense that people really are tangibly more happy if you can show that the machine, because of certain experiments done, the machine produces more matches. Let's say the match percentage increases by 5%. Well, that's a real number. And let's say that's 500 people. Those are real people. You can count that up. Happiness is, to some extent, in many cases, something you can measure. And dignity, by contrast, it's really hard to measure that. We've given many examples of how, right, we can say, look, the computer makes language, it reduces language to counterfeit, and makes everything empty and worthless. But how do you measure that? I mean, how do you measure human dignity? What are the units? With happiness, you have this unit, you can say, number of messages exchanged. Again, I know that's not a direct measure of happiness, and I know it's just an approximation, but it is an approximation, and it is a measure. Dignity, it just seems so ineffable, so abstract. Many people, for many people, they say, look, I want to stick with something that I can measure and that I can hope to improve instead of this abstract idea of dignity. And as it happens, we're going to talk about this later in social well-being, but as it happens, that in the 19th century, early 20th century, and throughout the 20th century, the English was a center of the utilitarian approach, which advocates for happiness against dignity. Nietzsche said no. This German said no. We should stick with dignity. And in that period, one of the foundational arguments against dignity was this argument that happiness can be measured to some extent, can be calculated to some extent. It's rational to some extent, whereas dignity seems ineffable. It can seem almost mystical. It's hard to say exactly. It's hard to look at dignity and say, "Hey, look, here's dignity. This is what it looks like. This is what color it has." All those things. It's very difficult, right? So this is just a very quick section, but what I want to say here is that frequently when people end up defending dignity against other perspectives, frequently as the debate goes on, it ends up getting into this kind of area where you have dignity as some kind of vague human value, some sense of intrinsic worth, which is my freedom from, my protection against being treated like a tool, and my right to take responsibility for my actions. Those are definitions, but they're still ineffable. Again, those kinds of general ideas versus something very specific like, oh, I can suffer less depression because I use this tool. Right? A lot of times that's what dignity debates look like, or where they end up. They end up with some very general arguments against more concrete arguments. And people will make their own decisions about what kind of argument is worth more. Okay? So maybe you could just take a minute or two to consider that as well. This question about whether, in general, the dignity of this ineffable thing is worth more than some more countable sense of, let's just say, happiness. Okay, and now we come to the last section, which also is just one slide. Where does dignity come from? There are lots of so first let me explain. In some sense, for Kant would say, look, dignity doesn't come from anywhere. Dignity is just what we have as human beings that makes us special, that makes us unique, that gives us value. And in this way, the ChatGPT, though I criticized the ChatGPT at the start, in this way, the ChatGPT is actually right. ChatGPT said, dignity is the intrinsic worth of humans. In some sense, at the end of the day, Kant says just that. He says, look, it doesn't come from anywhere. It's not the result of anything. Dignity is just the intrinsic value of being human. It's just a value we have as human beings. But for many people, this is kind of unsatisfying. We want to know. We want to say, well, is dignity what I have because I have fingernails? As far as I know, my mind is racing right now. But as far as I know, I think only human beings have kind of fingernails like this. I think. I'm not sure. But let's just say that. Let's just say only human beings have fingernails. Well, is that why I have dignity? Because I have fingernails? I'm pretty sure that's not it. I'm pretty sure that's not it. So most people who want to think about dignity do end up at one point or another sort of asking themselves, well, what is it about me as a human being that makes me the repository of this kind of dignity? If I had no fingernails, a horrible experiment, but let's just imagine that somehow I lost all my fingernails, I would still have dignity, right? So just no fingernails. So it's not fingernails that does it, that gives me dignity. So what is it? Now, there are a number of different kinds of possibilities, and I've just listed a few here, but there are many possibilities. And they kind of go from, in a sense, in evolutionary sense, down from low on to up. You could say maybe it's something simple. It's like my body that gives me dignity. But as soon as you say something like that, right, that I'm this bodied creature, I'm not like a candle or something. I have a body that I can move around and shape in one way or another. As soon as you say something like that, though, then the group of those who are included amongst the dignified, the group of those who need to be treated as though they have dignity, gets very big very quickly, right? If you're just going to say, look, just having a body is all you need, or maybe just a mind and a body, like Descartes, say, look, if we have a mind plus a body, then you have dignity. Then we quickly have questions, well, wait a minute. It's true that explains why human beings have dignity. That works. Good. But what about dogs then? Do dogs have dignity? Well, maybe. Dogs kind of seem fairly smart, but not real smart. Do dogs have dignity? If you say no, then what about smarter animals like dolphins or chimpanzees? Seems like, it can be really difficult. If it's just a mind plus a body that gives us dignity, then it seems like chimpanzees should qualify also as having dignity. And many people, I think, might say, look, okay, I can kind of buy that. Humans have dignity plus some higher animals. But if the definition is just minds plus bodies, then we descend fairly far down the ladder. We go down from chimpanzees, down to dogs, down to even cats, down to goats, and we keep going. There are a lot of creatures out there that have some form of brain or mind, and some form of brain and some form of body. So if we go that way, if we say, look, anything that has dignity has a brain if it has a brain and a body, then it's got dignity. Then all of a sudden, there's a lot of stuff out there with dignity. And it becomes very difficult. If we're going to take dignity seriously and treat the dignified as ends and not means, then we've got a lot of problems if we're going to say that everything with a brain and a body has dignity. There goes, we can't eat cows. Would you eat human beings, raise human beings for food? No, of course not. That's a complete lack of dignity, right? Because the human being is being treated purely as a thing, as a farm animal. But that is the way we treat cows. We treat them as things for milk and roosters and chickens, as things that make eggs and so on. So now we can't have milk, we can't have meat, we can't have eggs. If we blow up or widen the definition of what counts as the dignified, we are going to end up with some real changes in our lives. Plus, it just seems like really the kind of, this idea of dignity, which is supposed to be this very high and abstract and noble thing, it just seems like for most advocates, like chickens, even if they have brains and bodies, chickens don't really have dignity, So there's some hesitation about dignity being decided like that. It seems like if we use a really basic or rudimentary biological definition for what counts as having dignity, brains and bodies, then it seems like we have too many things that are dignified. So the response to that is that most people who want to think about dignity, they try to get a little higher quality. They say, look, it's not enough to have brains and bodies. You need to have something more than that to be counted as dignified. And so some people will add something like intelligence. It's unclear exactly what that means, or intentions, or self-consciousness. I think those last two things, self-consciousness and intentions, those two ideas can do quite a bit of work because self-conscious intention is the idea that, of course, that I step outside of myself. And let's say before I started doing this, before I started taping this, this seminar, I had a number of things I could have done, a number of responsibilities that I have. I'm writing a paper right now and I have a deadline, so I could have used this time to do that. I am supposed to respond to my emails once in a while, so I could have used this time to respond to emails. But I stood outside myself and formed the intention. I said, well, I'm going to use this time to do my seminar, and then later on I will do the paper, and then later on I will do the emails and so on. This self-consciousness, this idea that I don't just do actions, but I form an intention to do actions, this separates us from a lot of animals, right? Many animals live much more instinctively. They may have a brain and a body, but at least it seems, as far as we can tell, the many animals, what we call lower animals, do not have self-consciousness. They don't understand that they are making a decision. It's just that they have a kind of an instinct, like a fish says, look, it's time for me to eat. Oh, look, there's a fish. I will go eat it, right? The fish doesn't say, well, let's see, I could have my fish now, but I think I prefer to rest over here in the weeds for a while, and then I'll go have a quick conversation with Fran, and then I'll go eat that fish over there. As far as we can tell, fish aren't like that. Fish don't have any sense of themselves. Their instincts simply drive them to eat once in a while, in kind of the same way that my instincts drive me to breathe and for my heart to work and so on. But let's just say breathing, right? I mean, I don't think constantly, well, it's been 5 seconds. Should I take a breath now? No, I mean, my brain just does that normally, right? So most people think that a lot of animals live kind of like that, right? When they eat and so on, they do that without thinking about it in some sense, without self-consciousness. There's a kind of consciousness there, or a kind of instinct, but it's not self-conscious. It's not reflective upon themselves. They're not making a decision. So many people believe that the source of human dignity, what makes us special, is some form of this intelligent self-consciousness, some form of this intelligent purposiveness. Because we have this purpose, we have dignity, or that's maybe what reflects the fact that we have dignity. Okay, and that works well, because then now we can say, look, human beings have dignity, and maybe a very few higher level animals, but for the most part, we don't need to worry about it. Because trees and stuff obviously don't have dignity, and most animals, even farm animals, don't have dignity either. So we don't need to change our lives very much. And when we're worried about respecting and treating things as ends and not only as means, this is a labor. This is a lot of work. Treating people that way, it stops us from doing a lot of the things we want to do. It forces us to always be considering things and so on. At least we only have to put ourselves through that process. We only have to worry about that when we are talking about this very small group of living creatures here on Earth. We don't need to worry about it for insects. We don't need to worry about it for worms. Don't need to worry about ants. If we're walking down the street and we step on an ant, that's the way it goes. Don't need to worry about it, right? So dignity works a lot better when you start from that higher level of that higher bar, let's say, for what counts as having dignity. In order to have dignity, you must have self-conscious intelligence. But there's also a problem here too, because as soon as we start saying, look, you have to be up at the very top of the evolutionary chain to have this dignity, then what happens if we are visited by this species here, this species comes to Earth, and they have these huge brains that make them much more intelligent than we are, and let's say they have triple the possibility or power of self-consciousness we have, let's say, just one level of self-consciousness, but these beings from some other planet have developed self, right? 5 levels of self-consciousness. So for these alien beings, when they look at us, what they see are things like farm animals. Our degree of self-consciousness and our degree of intelligence compared to them seems very inferior, right? So by our own logic of what counts as having dignity, by our own logic, the dignity belongs to those with the highest level of self-consciousness and intelligence and intention. By our own logic, we would have to say to them, well, look, we need to treat you people, you space alien visitors, we need to treat you as highly dignified, and we need to respect you as ends and not means. But we would have to admit, you don't need to treat us that way, right? Because we are so far below you in these terms, in terms of self-consciousness and so on, we are almost like worms compared to you and your superpowers of triple self-consciousness and hyper-powered, huge-brained intelligence, right? That we ourselves are left without the dignity that we invented. Right? So it becomes here too. We get back in the situation where dignity is really hard to describe. We can say on the one hand, if we want to justify why human beings have this dignity, and we want to give reasons for it, we don't just want to say, well, it's just some hand-waving thing. It's just a belief we have. If it's more than that, if it's something we can explain and make it real, then we have to go one way. Then we have to give an explanation. And as soon as we do that, as soon as we say we have dignity because X, then we have problems at one extreme or the other. Either we go down, if the definition is too easy, let's say too broad, just mind and body, then we end up with way too many creatures having dignity. But if the definition, by contrast, is one that cuts out all those other creatures and forms this kind of hierarchy and says, well, look, you've got to be, the higher you are, the better. Well, then we've got this worry, as I say, that someone might come visiting us, and if they're higher than us, just like we are higher than farm animals, then by our own definition of dignity, it seems like they are going to be justified as treating us like farm animals, as treating us like commodities, like tools, like things that can be used for their ends. Right? And again, what's worrisome about this is it's by our own definition. They would have the right to put us on farms and harvest us and use us, again, as farm animals or as things or tools. So the difficulty in knowing or defining, what the justification is for dignity or what counts as having dignity is a tremendous potential problem. And the safe solution is just to do the hand-waving thing. It's just to say, well, I don't know why we have dignity, but as humans, we do, and no one else does. You can say that. You can do that. But it shouldn't satisfy you as a reasonable person. It should not satisfy you as a member of this seminar course where we try to explain and give reasons for why we think one thing or something else. But then in the end, it's also true, and very intelligent people take this position. They say, look, we have reasoned through it. We have thought about it. And we recognize this double problem about trying to explain what dignity is. And therefore, we come to the reasonable conclusion that there is no reason. And you can defend that, right? You can, as long as you can say, look, I have gone through all the reasonable possibilities, and therefore, and I found there is no one that is satisfying, but I still have this internal sense that human dignity exists, and that you and I are, as people, are different than this pen. I mean, if this pen breaks or runs out of ink, I just throw it out. And I don't care. I can replace it with another one from the same box, which is identical. And it makes no difference to me. But I have this real sensation that human beings are not like this pen. Human beings can't simply be replaced. Human beings can't simply be thrown out because they don't seem useful anymore. We have many nursing homes full of people who, the truth is, their contribution to sort of the greater human project is probably exhausted, but we don't just throw them out. And the reason we don't is because they have dignity. And all of us as human beings share that. We see it. We know it. We share that belief. And maybe we have to say that there are some things we just can't explain. That's reasonable. And you can defend that position. But you can only defend it right after you've gone through the steps we've just taken here. We've said, you know what? This dignity thing, there's some real weaknesses to it too. It's really hard to give a good explanation for why human beings should have this and only us. Okay, well, I think that's enough for dignity. Why don't you just take a few minutes to think for yourself and use your own experience, your own humanity, to try to decide whether or not dignity is real and whether or not dignity needs an explanation. And then just in general, what we have done today is we have seen these two definitions of dignity, the philosophical definitions. The one is that people should not be treated as tools or instruments. And the other is that the dignity is the right to take accountability for our actions, to not be treated as babies. And then we've seen how that works in a number of dilemmas. So that's dignity.